A small act of courage can change everything. Michael, a 12-year-old boy, stood up to protect an elderly couple from being harassed by a group of teenagers at a grocery store. But little did he know, this seemingly simple act would alter not only his life, but the lives of those around him forever. The next morning, a mysterious black SUV appeared outside Michael's house, triggering a series of tense and unexpected events. Was Michael's brave action the start of something greater? Join us as we uncover the powerful lessons of courage and community in this heartwarming story. Where are you watching this video from? Share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and share the video if you enjoy emotional and inspiring stories like this. Have you ever had to choose between your own safety and doing the right thing? Reflect on this and let us know. The golden glow of the late afternoon sun cast a warm light over the neighborhood, where the familiar sounds of children playing echoed in the air. Amid this seemingly peaceful setting, an event unfolded that would challenge Michael in ways he had never imagined. Walking home from school, Michael spotted Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, the elderly couple he deeply respected, struggling with a few heavy grocery bags. Just as he was about to step in to help, a group of teenagers appeared, their voices loud and mocking as they surrounded the couple. "What are you doing out here, Grandpa? Shouldn't you be in a nursing home or something?" One of them sneered. The laughter that followed was sharp, cold, and cruel. Michael froze, his heart pounding. Part of him wanted to turn away, to pretend he hadn't seen anything. But then his mother's words echoed in his mind. "It doesn't matter how small you are. What matters is that you do the right thing." Summoning all his courage, Michael stepped forward. "Leave them alone," he shouted, his voice cutting through the laughter. Every head turned toward him, eyes filled with surprise, ridicule, and even hostility. One of the teenagers, the tallest and most intimidating, strode toward Michael with a smug grin. "Look at this kid trying to play hero. You're going to regret this," he sneered, shoving Michael hard. The force sent Michael stumbling back, but he didn't fall. Instead, he straightened up, his gaze unwavering. "They haven't done anything to you. You have no right to bully them." The air grew thick with tension. The group of teenagers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado wavering. Just as the standoff reached its peak, the store manager stepped outside, his stern expression breaking the tension. "What's going on here?" he demanded, arms crossed. The teenagers quickly scattered under the manager's disapproving glare, leaving Michael to exhale a shaky breath of relief. His hands were trembling, but his heart was steady. He turned to the Thompsons, who looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You're a brave young man," Mr. Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. Michael simply smiled, realizing that even though he had been scared, he had done the right thing. The next morning, sunlight streamed through Michael's bedroom window, but the warmth did little to calm the unease still lingering in his chest. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind. The bullies, the Thompsons' gratitude, the rush of adrenaline. As he sat down for breakfast, his mother, Lena, placed a plate of pancakes in front of him, her smile warm and reassuring. "Good morning, sweetheart. How did you sleep?" she asked, ruffling his hair. Michael nodded, mumbling, "Pretty good," though his thoughts were elsewhere. He picked at his food, the fear from the encounter still fresh. Lena noticed his distraction, but chose not to press him. "If something's bothering you, you can always talk to me," she said gently. After breakfast, Michael grabbed his backpack and headed out the door. The air was crisp, the sounds of birds chirping filling the quiet neighborhood. For a moment, it felt like a normal day, but as Michael turned onto his street, his steps faltered. There it was, parked across from his house, a sleek black SUV with dark-tinted windows. Michael's heart skipped a beat. The vehicle stood out in their modest neighborhood, where most people drove older cars or walked. He'd never seen it before. The SUV sat there, silent and ominous, its windows hiding whoever might be inside. Michael tried to shake off the unease, convincing himself it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was someone visiting a neighbor. But as he walked past, his gut told him otherwise. He quickened his pace, resisting the urge to look back. When he finally reached the end of the street, he glanced over his shoulder. The SUV hadn't moved. It just sat there, unmoving like a silent watcher. By the time Michael reached school, the strange encounter had consumed his thoughts. His imagination ran wild with questions. Who was in that car? Why were they parked outside his house? Could it have something to do with what happened yesterday? He threw himself into his classes, trying to distract himself. But the lingering fear wouldn't go away. When the final bell rang, Michael felt a rush of relief. He was eager to get home, to feel the comfort of his mother's presence. But as he turned onto his street, his stomach twisted. The SUV was still there, parked in the exact same spot as before. This time, Michael was certain there was someone in the driver's seat, watching him. Michael froze for a moment, his breath catching in his throat. The engine rumbled softly, and for a brief second, he considered turning back. But then the SUV began to move, slowly pulling away from the curb. Michael's pulse raced as the sleek vehicle rolled to a stop right in front of his house. The driver's door opened, and two men stepped out. Both were dressed in dark suits, their polished appearances starkly out of place in the neighborhood. The taller man wore a friendly smile, while the shorter man carried a briefcase. "You must be Michael," the taller man said, his voice calm and warm. Michael hesitated, glancing toward his house where his mother stood watching from the porch. Her protective presence gave him the courage to speak. "Yes," he replied cautiously. "Who are you?" The shorter man stepped forward, extending a hand. "My name is Mr. Roberts, and this is Mr. Johnson. We're from a local community organization that supports elderly residents. We've been looking forward to meeting you." Michael didn't shake his hand. "Why were you watching me?" he asked bluntly, his voice trembling slightly. The two men exchanged glances, their smiles faltering. Mr. Johnson cleared his throat. "We apologize if we made you uncomfortable," he said. "It wasn't our intention. We've heard about what you did for Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, and we wanted to thank you in person." Michael blinked, surprised. He hadn't expected this. "You were waiting for me? Why?" Mr. Roberts unfolded a letter and handed it to Michael. "We wanted to present you with a commendation for your bravery. What you did wasn't just kind. It was inspiring." Michael took the letter, his hands trembling as he read the words of praise written in elegant script. He looked up at the two men, his initial fear replaced by confusion and a small sense of pride. "We'd also like to invite you and your mother to a community event," Mr. Roberts added. "You'll be honored for your courageous actions." Michael's eyes widened. "Honored? Me?" "Yes," Mr. Johnson replied with a warm smile. "You've shown the kind of bravery that brings people together. We think your story deserves to be shared." Michael glanced back at his mother, who had stepped down from the porch to stand beside him. Her expression shifted from worry to pride as she gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," Michael said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions. The two men nodded and handed Michael a neatly wrapped package. "This is a small token of appreciation from our organization," Mr. Roberts said. "Open it with your mother. We hope it'll help you both." As the men climbed back into the SUV, Michael stood there, still holding the letter and package. The vehicle drove away, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a newfound sense of gratitude. Michael turned to Lena, holding up the letter. "Mom, you're not going to believe this." Michael and Lena sat at their small kitchen table, the package from the mysterious men sitting between them. Michael's hands trembled with a mix of curiosity and nervousness as Lena carefully unwrapped the paper, revealing a beautifully crafted wooden box. Inside, they found an assortment of grocery gift cards, each one labeled with a local store's name. Beneath the gift cards was an envelope filled with cash and a handwritten note that read, "Asterisk for any financial needs you might have. Thank you for raising such a remarkable young man." Asterisk. Lena's eyes welled up with tears as she ran her fingers over the words. "Michael, this is incredible," she whispered. "We won't have to worry about groceries for months. We can finally catch up on the bills." Michael stared at the contents of the box, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I didn't do any of this for a reward, Mom. I just wanted to help Mr. and Mrs. Thompson." Lena reached over, taking his hand in hers. "And that's exactly why this happened. You did the right thing, Michael, and people noticed. I couldn't be prouder of you." A week later, the day of the community event arrived. Michael stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of the crisp white shirt Lena had bought him for the occasion. His reflection looked older, more confident, but inside, his nerves churned. "Michael," Lena called from downstairs. "Are you ready? We don't want to be late." "Coming, Mom," he replied, taking a deep breath to steady himself. This was his first time being honored in front of so many people. As they walked hand in hand to the community center, Michael noticed how different the neighborhood felt. The streets that once seemed ordinary now felt alive with warmth and unity. Colorful banners hung outside the community center, proclaiming Community Heroes Celebration in bold letters. Mr. Roberts and Mr. Johnson greeted them warmly at the entrance, their smiles wide and reassuring. "Michael, we're so glad you're here," Mr. Roberts said. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Michael admitted with a small smile, "but excited too." "That's normal," Mr. Johnson replied, clapping him gently on the shoulder. "But don't worry, everyone here is rooting for you." As they entered the main hall, Michael froze. The space was filled with people, neighbors, teachers, classmates, even the local shopkeepers. The sight of so many familiar faces clapping and smiling made Michael's cheeks flush. He felt Lena squeeze his hand, her silent encouragement giving him the strength to keep moving forward. At the front of the room stood Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, their faces beaming with pride. Mrs. Thompson's eyes glistened with tears as she pulled Michael into a hug. "Oh, Michael," she said, her voice trembling. "We can never thank you enough for what you did." Mr. Thompson placed a firm hand on Michael's shoulder. "You're a fine young man," he said gruffly. "What you did, it meant more than you could ever know." Before Michael could respond, Mr. Johnson's voice rang out over the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. We're about to begin." Michael sat at the front of the room with Lena, his nerves building as Mr. Johnson began to speak. "Tonight, we gather to honor acts of kindness, bravery, and compassion that remind us of the best in humanity," he said. "And today, we're here to celebrate a young man who, when faced with a difficult situation, chose to do what was right rather than what was easy. Please join me in welcoming Michael to the stage." The room erupted into applause as Michael stood, his legs wobbling slightly. Lena gave him one last reassuring nod before he made his way to the podium. The sea of smiling faces stared back at him, their encouragement filling him with a quiet determination. Michael gripped the edges of the podium, his voice trembling at first but growing stronger as he spoke. "Good evening, everyone. I'm not sure what to say. I didn't do what I did for recognition or praise. I did it because it was the right thing to do." He paused, glancing at Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson have been like grandparents to me for as long as I can remember. When I saw those boys harassing them, I knew I couldn't just stand by. I was scared, but I remembered something my mom always says, asterisk, it doesn't matter how small you are. What matters is that you do what's right. Asterisk." Michael took a deep breath, looking out at the crowd. "Standing here tonight, I realized this wasn't just about me. It was about all of us, our community, coming together to stand against cruelty and injustice. Kindness matters. Compassion matters. Doing the right thing matters." The room was silent, hanging on his every word. "So I want to challenge all of you," Michael continued. "The next time you see someone in need, don't look away. Don't pretend it's not your problem. Stand up. Speak out. Do what's right. Because that's what being a community is all about." As he finished, the room erupted into a standing ovation. Tears stung Michael's eyes as he stepped away from the podium, shaking hands and receiving pats on the back from countless people. When he finally returned to his seat, Lena wrapped him in a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. That night, as Michael lay in bed, he thought about the faces in the crowd, the warmth of their applause, and the feeling of unity in the room. What had started as a single act of courage had grown into something much bigger. And for the first time, he truly understood the power of doing what's right. In the days following the community event, life began to change for Michael. The weight of fear that had once hung over him like a dark cloud had been replaced with a newfound sense of purpose and pride. The mysterious black SUV, once a source of dread, had become a symbol of something far greater: the recognition of his bravery and the support of his community. Michael's story had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Teachers praised him in class. Classmates who once overlooked him now sought him out, and local news outlets even ran stories about the young hero. But amidst all the attention, Michael remained humble, focusing on what mattered most, using his experience to inspire others. One afternoon, as Michael sat at the kitchen table with Lena, reviewing his homework, the phone rang. Lena answered, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise. "Michael," she called out, holding the receiver. "It's Mr. Johnson. He wants to talk to you." Michael quickly took the phone, nervous but excited. "Hello, Michael, it's Mr. Johnson. I hope you're doing well," the familiar voice said warmly. "I wanted to thank you again for your incredible speech at the event. It was truly inspiring." "Thank you, sir," Michael replied, his voice modest. "I'm just glad people listened." "They more than listened, Michael," Mr. Johnson continued. "You've started something special here. The community has been buzzing with ideas for how we can keep the spirit of that night alive. And I was hoping you'd be part of it." "Part of it? How?" Michael asked, intrigued. "We're starting a youth outreach program," Mr. Johnson explained. "We want to encourage kids like you to stand up for what's right and get involved in their communities. You'd be the perfect person to lead the charge." Michael's heart skipped a beat. The thought of standing in front of other kids, sharing his story, and helping them find their own courage was exciting but also daunting. "Me? Lead the program?" "Yes," Mr. Johnson said confidently. "You've already shown you have what it takes, and I think your voice could make a real difference." Michael glanced at Lena, who was listening nearby, her expression filled with pride. She nodded encouragingly. "I'd love to," Michael finally said. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity." The following week, Michael attended his first youth outreach meeting at the community center. The room was filled with kids of all ages, their curious faces turning toward him as he stepped to the front. His palms were sweaty, and his heart raced, but as he began to speak, the nerves melted away. He told them about the day at the grocery store, the fear he had felt, and the moment he decided to act despite it. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," Michael said, his voice steady. "It means you do what's right, even when you're scared." The kids listened intently, their eyes wide with admiration. After the meeting, several of them approached Michael, sharing their own stories of fear and hesitation. One girl tearfully confessed she had witnessed bullying but had been too scared to step in. Michael encouraged her, telling her it was never too late to do the right thing. As the weeks went by, the outreach program grew. Michael suggested starting a peer support group where kids could share their experiences and brainstorm ways to make their schools and neighborhoods safer. Mr. Johnson loved the idea, and soon the Young Champions group was born. The group quickly gained popularity, with new members joining each week. Michael led the meetings with confidence, fostering an environment where everyone felt heard and valued. Together, they organized community projects, from cleanup days to anti-bullying campaigns, making a tangible difference in the neighborhood. One crisp autumn afternoon, Michael visited the Thompsons to help rake leaves in their yard. As he worked, Mr. Thompson stepped outside, leaning heavily on his cane, but smiling warmly. "You know, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "what you did that day, it didn't just help us. It changed this whole community." Michael paused, leaning on the rake. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said, echoing words he had said many times before. Mr. Thompson shook his head. "No, Michael, not everyone would have done what you did. It takes a special kind of courage to stand up when others look away. Look around you, people are kinder now. They look out for each other more. And it's because of you." Michael felt a lump rise in his throat as he glanced around the neighborhood. Neighbors waved to each other. Children played together, and there was a warmth in the air that hadn't been there before. "I couldn't have done any of it without you and Mrs. Thompson," Michael said softly. "You've always been so kind to me. I just wanted to repay that kindness." "You've done more than repay it," Mr. Thompson said, his eyes misting over. "You've reminded us all what it means to be good neighbors." As Michael walked home that evening, his mind raced with ideas for the next Young Champions project. Maybe they could organize a tutoring program or help out at a local shelter. The possibilities seemed endless, and Michael felt a deep sense of purpose. When he reached home, Lena was waiting with her usual warm smile. She listened as he excitedly shared his plans, her pride evident in her eyes. As they sat down for dinner, Michael realized just how much his life had changed since that day at the grocery store. What had started as a single act of courage had grown into something much larger than himself. Michael had found his voice, his purpose, and his place in a community that cared. And he knew this was only the beginning. Together, they could make a difference, one small act of kindness at a time. The weeks turned into months, and Michael's involvement in the Young Champions program began to blossom. His story had become a beacon of hope, inspiring not just kids but adults in the community as well. The once shy boy who hesitated to speak in front of crowds now stood confidently, sharing his journey and encouraging others to make a difference. The Young Champions group expanded beyond their neighborhood, reaching other schools and districts. Michael, now seen as a young leader, was invited to speak at assemblies, community meetings, and even charity events. His message was simple yet powerful. One act of courage can create a ripple effect of kindness. One day, as Michael was reviewing plans for the group's next community project, he received a call from Mr. Johnson. His voice was filled with excitement. "Michael, I have some incredible news," Mr. Johnson said. "The mayor's office has heard about your work with Young Champions and wants to meet with you." Michael nearly dropped the phone. "The mayor? To meet with me?" "That's right," Mr. Johnson confirmed. "They're impressed by what you've accomplished and want to discuss how your ideas could be implemented citywide." "This is a big opportunity, Michael." A week later, Michael and Lena arrived at City Hall. Dressed in his best shirt and tie, Michael felt a mix of nerves and excitement as they entered the grand building. The mayor greeted them warmly, shaking Michael's hand with genuine admiration. "I've heard a lot about you, young man," the mayor said. "Your story is exactly what this city needs, a reminder that change starts with individuals willing to stand up for what's right." During the meeting, Michael shared his vision for expanding Young Champions. He proposed initiatives like mentorship programs, neighborhood watch teams, and youth-led community service projects. The mayor listened intently, nodding in agreement. "These are fantastic ideas, Michael," the mayor said. "We'd love to support you in making them a reality. How would you feel about being an ambassador for youth involvement in the city?" Michael's heart raced. "I'd be honored," he replied, his voice steady despite his excitement. Back at home, Michael threw himself into the work with renewed energy. The Young Champions group organized their first citywide project, a neighborhood cleanup day. Hundreds of volunteers turned out, inspired by Michael's leadership and the group's enthusiasm. The event was a resounding success. Streets were cleaned, parks were restored, and bonds between neighbors grew stronger. As Michael walked through the transformed neighborhoods, he couldn't help but feel proud of what they had achieved together. One Saturday afternoon, Michael visited Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, as he often did. The couple had become like family to him, their home a place of comfort and warmth. As they sat on the porch, sipping lemonade, Mrs. Thompson looked at Michael with a soft smile. "Michael," she began, her voice filled with emotion, "do you realize how much you've changed this community? It's because of you that people believe in each other again." Michael shook his head, his humility shining through. "I couldn't have done it alone. It's the people here. They're the ones who make the difference." Mr. Thompson chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "And you're the spark, son. Don't ever forget that." That night, as Michael sat at his desk, he reflected on how far he had come. His journey had begun with a single choice to stand up for what was right, and it had grown into something he never could have imagined. The fear and doubt he once felt had been replaced by purpose and confidence. As he wrote down ideas for future projects, he smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning. There were still challenges to face, injustices to fight, and communities to uplift. But with the support of his mother, the Thompsons, and his community, Michael felt ready to take on anything. And as he turned off the light and climbed into bed, one thought stayed with him. Even the smallest act of kindness can light a fire that changes the world. Michael's days had taken on a new rhythm, one filled with purpose and a growing sense of responsibility. Each morning, He woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his window and the warmth of sunlight streaming through the curtains. He would eat breakfast with Lena, her gentle encouragement setting the tone for his day, before heading out to the community center where the Young Champions program had become his second home. What had once been a small group of local kids had now grown into a movement that spanned schools and neighborhoods across the city. One Tuesday afternoon, Michael stood in front of a room filled with eager young faces. These were kids who had heard his story and wanted to make a difference in their own ways. Michael shared the lessons he had learned, not shying away from the moments of fear and uncertainty he had faced. Courage doesn't mean you're not scared, he told them. It means doing the right thing even when you are scared. After the meeting, a boy named Jason approached him. Jason was quiet and reserved, his eyes filled with doubt as he spoke. I want to help, but I don't think I'm brave enough, he admitted. Michael knelt to meet Jason's gaze, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You don't have to be fearless to make a difference, he said. Start small. Help someone carry their bags or stand up for a friend. Even the smallest actions can inspire others. Michael's words seemed to spark something in Jason, and over the weeks that followed, he watched as the boy grew more confident, taking on leadership roles within the group. It was moments like these that reminded Michael why he had started this journey, to show others the power of standing up for what's right. The outreach program continued to expand, and soon, Michael found himself invited to speak at citywide events. Standing on large stages in front of hundreds of people, he shared his story with a mix of humility and passion. At one such event, the mayor introduced him as an example of what youth can achieve when they're driven by kindness and courage. The applause that followed filled Michael with pride, but it was the conversations he had afterward, listening to others share their stories of triumph and struggle, that meant the most to him. One evening, after a particularly busy day, Michael returned home to find Lena waiting for him in the kitchen. She had cooked his favorite meal, and they sat together at the table, the warmth of the moment washing over them. You've been working so hard, Lena said, her voice filled with pride. I hope you know how proud I am of you. Michael smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. Everything I do, Mom, is because of what you've taught me. You've always shown me what it means to care about others. Lena reached across the table to take his hand. And you've taken that lesson further than I ever imagined. You're making a difference, Michael, and I couldn't be prouder. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. When Michael opened it, he was surprised to see Mr. Roberts and Mr. Johnson standing there, their expressions bright with excitement. They handed him an envelope, explaining that it contained an invitation to an upcoming city council meeting where Michael would be honored for his contributions to the community. They want to hear your ideas for youth engagement, Mr. Roberts said. It's a big step forward. The weeks leading up to the meeting were a whirlwind of preparation. Michael worked tirelessly, drafting proposals and refining his presentation with Lena's help. On the day of the meeting, he stood before the council with a calm confidence that surprised even him. He spoke about the importance of youth involvement, outlining initiatives like mentorship programs, peer support groups, and community service projects. His passion was evident, and by the end of his speech, the council members were nodding in agreement. One council member stood to address him. Michael, your ideas are not only inspiring, but actionable. We'd like to work with you to implement these programs across the city. The room erupted into applause, and Michael felt a swell of pride. This wasn't just about him. It was about creating a legacy of kindness and courage that others could carry forward. Back in his neighborhood, the impact of Michael's efforts was palpable. People were kinder, more connected. The once divided streets now buzzed with a sense of unity. Neighbors greeted each other warmly, children played without fear, and families came together to support one another. Michael often visited the Thompsons, their home a refuge from the busyness of his new role. Sitting on their porch, sipping lemonade, and listening to their stories reminded him of why he had started this journey in the first place. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the yard, Mr. Thompson leaned on his cane and looked out at the neighborhood. Michael, he said, his voice thick with emotion, what you've done here is more than we ever could have imagined. You've reminded us all of what it means to be a community, Michael smiled, his gaze following Mr. Thompson's. "I couldn't have done it without you and Mrs. Thompson. You've always been there for me, and I just wanted to repay that kindness." Mrs. Thompson reached over to pat his hand. "And you've repaid it 1,000 times over," she said, her voice warm with affection. As Michael walked home that evening, his mind was already racing with new ideas. There was still so much to be done, so many ways to help. But for the first time, he felt a deep sense of balance between his growing responsibilities and the quiet, personal moments that kept him grounded. That night, as he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Michael reflected on the journey that had brought him here. It had all started with one choice, one decision to stand up for what was right. That small act of courage had grown into something far greater than he ever could have imagined. And while he didn't know what the future held, he was ready to face it with the same determination that had carried him this far. As he drifted off to sleep, a sense of peace washed over him. He knew that the work he was doing mattered, that it was making a real difference. And he knew that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would continue to stand for kindness, courage, and community. Because even the smallest act of bravery can light a fire that changes the world. As the seasons changed, Michael's role in the community continued to grow, his influence reaching places he never thought possible. Invitations poured in for him to speak at schools, community centers, and even regional youth conferences. Each time he stood before a crowd, his message was clear. Courage and kindness could transform lives, starting with the smallest of actions. His confidence blossomed, and with each word he spoke, he saw hope light up in the eyes of those who listened. One day, as Michael was preparing for another Young Champions meeting, Lena approached him with an envelope in her hand. "This came in the mail today," she said, her voice tinged with excitement. Michael opened it to find an invitation to an award ceremony hosted by a prestigious non-profit organization that celebrated young leaders making a difference in their communities. "They want to honor you, Michael," Lena said, her eyes brimming with pride. "You've touched so many lives." Michael stared at the invitation, a mix of pride and disbelief washing over him. "I didn't set out to be recognized," he said quietly. "I just wanted to help. And that's exactly why you deserve this," Lena replied, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Your actions inspire others, and that's worth celebrating." The weeks leading up to the ceremony were a whirlwind of preparations. Michael continued balancing his duties with Young Champions while reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. On the night of the event, he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the tie Lena had helped him pick out. Dressed in a tailored suit that had been gifted by the community, he looked every bit the young leader he had become. "You look perfect," Lena said from the doorway, her voice thick with emotion. "Your father would be so proud." Michael turned to her, his heart swelling at her words. "Thanks, Mom. I wouldn't be here without you." At the ceremony, Michael found himself surrounded by a room full of accomplished individuals, activists, leaders, and changemakers from all walks of life. As his name was called, the audience erupted into applause. Michael walked to the stage, his heart pounding with a mix of nerves and gratitude. Standing at the podium, he looked out at the sea of faces, each one filled with encouragement. "I'm honored to be here tonight," Michael began, his voice steady. "But this award isn't just for me. It's for my community. Everything I've done started with the values my mother taught me and the kindness shown by people like Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. They taught me that even small acts of courage and compassion can create ripples that spread far beyond what we can see." He paused, letting his words sink in. "To anyone out there who feels small or unsure of their place in the world, I want you to know this. You matter. Your actions matter. Standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, is how we create change. And together, we can build a world where kindness and justice prevail." The audience rose to their feet, the sound of their applause reverberating through the room. Michael felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not from the recognition, but from the knowledge that his words had resonated. As he returned to his seat, Lena squeezed his hand, her pride shining through her tear-filled eyes. In the weeks that followed, the momentum continued to build. Young Champions expanded its reach, partnering with local organizations to address issues like poverty, education, and community safety. Michael worked tirelessly, coordinating events and mentoring new members. Despite the demands on his time, he never lost sight of the relationships that mattered most. He still visited the Thompsons regularly, helping them with chores and enjoying their warm conversations. One autumn evening, as Michael raked leaves in the Thompsons' yard, Mrs. Thompson brought out a tray of hot cocoa and cookies. They sat together on the porch, the air crisp and filled with the faint scent of wood smoke. "You've done so much for this community," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice soft. "But don't forget to take care of yourself, too." Michael smiled, her words sinking in. "I will," he promised. "I just feel like there's so much more to do." "There always will be," Mr. Thompson chimed in, his tone wise and steady. "But remember, you're not alone in this. You've built something bigger than yourself, and it will continue to grow because of the people you've inspired." Michael nodded, their words grounding him. As he walked home that night, he felt a renewed sense of balance. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about empowering others to carry the torch. That night, as he sat at his desk, sketching out plans for a new mentorship initiative, Michael felt a profound sense of gratitude. He thought about the people who had supported him along the way. His mother, whose unwavering love and guidance had been his foundation, the Thompsons, who had shown him the power of kindness, and the countless individuals in his community who had believed in his vision. The journey wasn't over. There were still challenges to face, still lives to touch, and still dreams to chase. But Michael knew he was ready. With every step forward, he carried the lessons of his past and the hope of a brighter future. As he climbed into bed, the world outside quiet and still, Michael closed his eyes with a sense of peace. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new challenges, and new ways to make a difference. And he was ready to face them all, knowing that even the smallest act of courage could change the world. As the months turned into years, Michael's journey continued to unfold in ways he never imagined. The Young Champions program had become a cornerstone of the community, with chapters springing up in neighboring cities and towns. Michael's name was now synonymous with hope, courage, and the belief that anyone, no matter their age or circumstances, could make a difference. Despite his growing responsibilities, Michael remained grounded, never losing sight of the values that had guided him from the beginning. One brisk winter morning, Michael found himself at the steps of the state capitol building. He had been invited to speak at a youth leadership summit, where young advocates from across the state gathered to share ideas and inspire change. Dressed in a suit that felt both unfamiliar and empowering, Michael took a deep breath as he stepped up to the podium, the large hall buzzing with anticipation. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady and confident. "I'm standing here today not because of something extraordinary I've done, but because of the extraordinary power of community. Everything I've accomplished has been possible because people believed in me, supported me, and taught me that courage is contagious." He shared the story of the grocery store, the Thompsons, and the mysterious SUV that had sparked the beginning of his journey. As he spoke, the audience was silent, their expressions filled with admiration and reflection. "Each of us has the ability to light a spark," Michael continued, "to take a small action that grows into something bigger than we could ever imagine. It's not about being perfect or fearless. It's about being willing to try." By the time he finished, the room erupted into applause, and Michael felt a wave of pride and gratitude. As he stepped off the stage, a group of teenagers approached him, their eyes wide with excitement. "You're the reason we started our own outreach program," one of them said. "Your story showed us that we could make a difference too." Michael smiled, his heart swelling. "You already are," he replied, "and I can't wait to see what you'll do next." Back in his neighborhood, the sense of unity and kindness had only deepened. Neighbors who once passed each other with polite nods now shared meals, organized block parties, and worked together on community projects. Michael often marveled at the transformation, knowing that it had all begun with a single choice to stand up for what was right. One evening, as Michael helped Lena prepare dinner, she paused to look at him, her eyes filled with pride. "You've grown into someone your father would have been so proud of," she said softly. Michael's throat tightened at her words. "I hope I'm making him proud," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are," Lena said firmly. "And you're making this whole community proud, too." That night, Michael sat at his desk, reflecting on the path his life had taken. The challenges he faced, the fear he overcame, and the connections he built had shaped him into a leader. But more than that, they had shown him the power of small acts of kindness and bravery. As he drifted off to sleep, his thoughts turned to the future. He dreamed of expanding Young Champions even further, of helping other communities find their strength and unity. And while he didn't know exactly what lay ahead, he knew he was ready to face it. Because, as Michael had learned time and time again, even the smallest act of courage could ignite a fire that changed the world. And with each new day, he was determined to keep that fire burning bright because of the people around me. The people who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. The ones who taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're scared. And the ones who showed me that every small act of kindness can make a ripple that turns into something powerful. As Michael spoke, his eyes scanned the room, meeting the gazes of dozens of young people who were hanging on his every word. He could see the hope in their eyes, the same hope he had once felt when he made the decision to defend the Thompsons all those months ago. It was as if a circle had come full circle, and the ripple he had set in motion was now reaching others, inspiring them to take their own steps toward courage. When he finished his speech, the room erupted in applause. But Michael didn't stand there basking in the praise. He simply smiled and nodded, his thoughts drifting to the days when he had been that shy, uncertain boy, wondering if one small action could ever matter. Now, standing before this group of young leaders, he knew that his simple act had created a wave that was bigger than anything he could have imagined. That night, as he sat down at the dinner table with Lena, she looked at him with the same pride in her eyes she always had. But there was something more, a sense of peace, knowing that her son had found his purpose. They shared a quiet meal, the room filled with a contented silence, each of them reflecting on how far they had come. The next day, as Michael walked to school, he saw a familiar face across the street. It was Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, the elderly couple he had defended all those months ago. They waved at him, their smiles as warm as ever. Michael waved back, his heart swelling with gratitude. What began as a simple act of bravery had not only transformed his life, but had ripple effects that touched the lives of everyone around him. And as the days passed, Michael knew that the journey was far from over. He had learned that courage wasn't just about doing something big. It was about showing up, doing the right thing, and inspiring others to do the same. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. A lesson that no matter how small the action, it could spark a change that would last forever, really make a difference. Now, as he looked around at the faces of the young leaders in front of him, he realized the answer was clear. His actions had sparked a movement, a wave of change that was much bigger than he ever imagined. He had not only defended the Thompsons that day, he had stood up for something greater. Humanity's ability to come together in the face of adversity, to stand up for what's right, and to lift each other up in times of need. Later that evening, as he walked back to his hotel room, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman he had protected so long ago. "Michael," the message read, "I just saw you speak at the summit on the news. We are so proud of you. You've not only changed our lives, but the lives of so many others. Keep going, Michael. The world needs more people like you." Reading her words, Michael felt a warmth spread through his chest. He had never expected to be called a hero. He had simply done what felt right. But now, as his journey had evolved, he realized that heroism wasn't about fame or accolades. It was about integrity, compassion, and standing firm in your beliefs, no matter the consequences. As he lay in bed that night, reflecting on everything that had happened, he couldn't help but think of all the people who had supported him along the way. The community, the mentors, his family. None of this would have been possible without them. And as he closed his eyes, Michael made a quiet promise to himself. He would continue to fight for what was right, to inspire others to do the same, and to always stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. In the end, The impact of his bravery wasn't just measured in the accolades he received or the recognition he earned. It was measured in the countless lives he had touched, the hearts he had moved, and the future he had helped shape. And Michael knew, without a doubt, that his journey had only just begun a hero, but in that moment, he realized that perhaps, in some small way, he had become one. Not because of the recognition or the awards, but because he had chosen to do the right thing when it mattered most. And that choice had created a ripple that had turned into something much larger than he could have ever anticipated. As Michael stood by the window that evening, gazing at the city lights twinkling in the distance, he thought about how far he had come since that fateful day in the grocery store. He thought about the fear he had felt, the doubt that had crept in when he decided to step up, and how, in the end, it had all led him to this point. He was no longer just a kid in his neighborhood. He was a symbol of hope, of courage, and of what happens when one person dares to make a difference. But even as he reflected on his journey, he knew his work was far from over. The world was still full of challenges, injustices, and moments when people needed someone to stand up for them. Michael had only just begun. He would continue to lead, inspire, and challenge others to step out of their comfort zones and fight for what's right. Because he had learned something invaluable along the way. When one person acts with courage, it can inspire a community to rise, and together, they can change the world. As he turned off the light and lay down to sleep that night, Michael knew that tomorrow would bring more opportunities, more chances to do what was right, no matter how difficult. And no matter where his journey took him, he would always remember that it all began with one simple act of bravery. And there were still countless people who needed the same kind of encouragement and support he had received. He wasn't finished yet. Michael understood now that his role was not just about sharing his story, but empowering others to take their own steps of courage, no matter how small. Each new day brought another chance to inspire, to lead, and to make an impact. The next morning, as he woke up to another busy day, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had a meeting with the Young Champions group later that afternoon, where they would plan their next community project, a drive to collect food and supplies for families in need. He couldn't wait to share his vision with them, to see the excitement in their eyes as they too realized the power they had to make a difference. As Michael walked through the streets of his neighborhood, he couldn't help but notice how much had changed. The streets that once seemed quiet and ordinary were now full of possibility. The faces he passed weren't just neighbors. They were people who had been inspired by his journey and were now finding their own ways to contribute. The ripple had spread, and it was still growing. He realized that what started with a single act of courage had now become a movement, one that transcended boundaries and brought people together in the pursuit of something greater. Michael's journey was far from over, but in that moment, he understood something profound. Change begins with one person, but it doesn't stop there. It grows, spreads, and multiplies until it becomes a force too powerful to ignore. And Michael, the boy who once feared standing up for what was right, was now part of a movement that was changing the world their own courage to take action, to stand up for what was right. It was in the way they greeted him now, with smiles of respect and gratitude, that he realized the change was not just within himself, but in the community around him. People were beginning to see that no act of kindness was too small and no voice too quiet. As he reached the community center, Michael paused for a moment outside the door, taking a deep breath. He had come a long way from the boy who had once been uncertain about speaking up, uncertain about the impact of his actions. Now, as he entered the room full of eager young faces, he felt ready to continue leading, ready to keep inspiring. He wasn't just building a movement. He was shaping a future where people chose courage over fear, kindness over indifference, and unity over division. The rest of the afternoon was spent planning their next big project, a local initiative to mentor younger kids and guide them through situations where they might need to find the courage to do the right thing. Michael shared his story, not as a way to seek applause, but to remind them that they, too, could be the change they wanted to see in the world. As the meeting wrapped up, Michael stepped outside with a sense of fulfillment, knowing that the ripple he had started so long ago was now a wave, one that was spreading further than he had ever imagined. And with each new wave of change, he knew the journey would continue, because the real work was just beginning. Could feel the excitement in the air as the room buzzed with ideas. It was clear that these young minds had been touched by his story, just as he had once been touched by the kindness and bravery of others. They were eager to make a difference, to step up and become the kind of people who stood tall in the face of adversity. Michael was no longer just a figurehead. He was now part of something larger than himself. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them, the collective power of a community coming together for a common cause. As the meeting wrapped up, Michael felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The plans they had laid out that day would soon come to life, and he could already imagine the impact it would have. The ripple he had started was now spreading, and he knew it was only the beginning. He had always believed that one small act of courage could change everything, but seeing the energy and determination in the eyes of the kids around him made that belief even stronger. They were all willing to take the same leap of faith, to do what was right, even when it was hard. And that, Michael knew, was how real change happened. Walking home that evening, Michael reflected on how much his life had changed since that fateful day in the grocery store. He had started out as a scared, uncertain boy, unsure of what he could do to make a difference. Now, he was a leader, an example of what happens when someone dares to act with courage and conviction. He wasn't just doing this for himself anymore. He was doing it for all the people who had been inspired by him, his family, his friends, his community. When he reached home, Lena was waiting for him with a warm smile. As Michael stepped inside, she gave him a quick hug. "How was your day, sweetheart?" "It was amazing, Mom," he replied, his voice filled with excitement. "We plan the next big project for Young Champions. We're going to mentor kids who need help finding their courage. It feels good, like we're really making a difference." Lena's eyes shone with pride as she looked at her son. "I always knew you were destined for something special, Michael. I'm so proud of you. More than you could ever know." Michael smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for the woman who had supported him through it all. He knew he couldn't have done any of this without her unwavering belief in him. As he headed upstairs to finish his homework, he couldn't help but feel that his journey was just beginning. There were still so many people who needed his help, so many more lives to touch. The world was full of challenges, but Michael no longer felt overwhelmed. He knew that with each small step, with each act of courage, they could make a difference. As the weeks passed, Michael continued to inspire. His work with Young Champions grew, and soon they were involved in a series of community service projects that ranged from cleaning up local parks to helping elderly residents with yard work. But it wasn't just the projects that mattered, it was the relationships that were being built, the sense of unity that was growing among the people in his community. Michael's efforts were now being recognized by leaders in the city, and he was invited to speak at more events, to share his story with even larger audiences. One day, as he walked to the podium at a citywide conference on youth leadership, Michael paused for a moment to take in the crowd. The room was filled with hundreds of people, young and old, from all walks of life. As he looked around, he saw the faces of his peers, the other young leaders who had been inspired by his story and who were now using their voices to make a difference in their own communities. It was a humbling experience. He had started this journey as a 12-year-old boy, unsure of his place in the world, and now, at 16, he was standing before a room full of people who saw him as a leader. When it was his turn to speak, Michael stepped up to the microphone, his heart racing. But as he began to speak, the nerves faded. He remembered why he was there, why this work was so important. "I'm here today because I believe that each of us has the power to change the world," he began. "It doesn't take a superhero to make a difference. It takes a person who is willing to act, to step up when things are tough, and to do what's right even when it's not easy." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Michael continued, his voice growing stronger with each sentence. "When I stood up for Mr. and Mrs. Thompson all those months ago, I didn't know it would change my life. But it did, and I'm standing here today because I believe that one act of courage can spark something bigger than we can imagine. If we all just take one step forward, if we all just choose to do what's right when we have the chance, we can create a ripple that can change everything." The applause that followed was deafening, and for a moment, Michael stood there, overwhelmed by the recognition. But as he looked out at the crowd, he saw something in their eyes, something that made the applause seem insignificant. It was hope. Hope that they too could make a difference. And in that moment, Michael realized that the true reward of his journey wasn't the praise, the awards, or the recognition. It was the hope he had inspired in others, the spark he had ignited in their hearts. As Michael left the stage, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come full circle, from that scared boy in the grocery store, unsure of his place in the world, to a young man leading a movement of courage, kindness, and community. He knew there was still much to be done, but as long as there were people willing to step up, willing to act, he knew that change was possible, and that, more than anything, was worth fighting for to put aside their fears and doubts and take action. Michael realized that this movement was no longer just his. He had ignited a fire that was now burning brightly in others, and together they could accomplish so much more than he ever could alone. As the days passed, the group's first community project came to fruition. They collected food, clothes, and school supplies for families who were struggling. Michael felt a deep sense of gratitude as he watched the volunteers working together, the sense of unity palpable in the air. He had never imagined that something so simple could have such a profound impact. What started as a small idea had grown into something powerful, a testament to the power of collective action. In the evenings, after long days of planning and organizing, Michael would sit with Lena, reflecting on everything that had happened. He still couldn't believe how far he had come. A few months ago, he had been just a regular kid, unsure of his place in the world. But now, he was someone people looked up to, someone who had sparked a change in the community. Lena would listen attentively, proud but never surprised. She always knew Michael had something special inside him. She just never realized how far his light would shine. One particular evening, after a particularly successful event where they managed to raise more donations than expected, Michael sat with his mother on the porch, watching the sunset. "Mom, do you ever think about how everything started?" he asked quietly, his voice soft as he gazed out at the horizon. Lena smiled, her eyes filled with warmth. "Every day, Michael. But you know what? I think you always had it in you. You were always a brave, compassionate soul. You just needed to believe in yourself, and that's what you did. You chose to act, even when it was hard, and that's what changed everything." Michael nodded, feeling a surge of emotion. "I never thought that one moment could lead to all of this. But now, I see that we all have the power to make a difference. Even when it feels like the world is too big or too broken, we have a choice. We can choose to act. We can choose kindness, courage, and love." That evening, Michael felt a quiet satisfaction settle within him. He wasn't done yet. There was still so much to do. But as he looked back on everything that had happened, he realized that he had found his purpose. He had found his place in the world, not as a hero, but as someone who helped others see the hero in themselves. And that, to him, was the greatest gift of all. As he lay in bed that night, Michael couldn't help but think about the future. He had dreams now, bigger than he had ever imagined before. He wanted to continue helping others, to make the world a better place one small act at a time. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be challenges and obstacles along the way. But now, more than ever, he believed in the power of change. He believed in the power of one person's choice to stand up for what is right. And as he drifted off to sleep, Michael knew one thing for certain. The ripple he had started had just begun. The world was full of people waiting for their moment to step up, to make a difference. And together, they would create a future full of hope, courage, and kindness. Michael's story was just the beginning of a much larger movement, one that would continue to grow and spread far beyond the boundaries of his community. In the days that followed, Michael became a mentor to others, teaching them the lessons he had learned along the way, the importance of standing up for what is right, of using your voice to make a difference, and of never underestimating the power of one person's actions. He found that, by guiding others, he could create a ripple effect of his own. Each person he mentored, each young leader he helped inspire, was another piece of the puzzle in a much larger picture. Years later, as he stood before a room of hundreds of young people, Michael knew he had made an impact. But he also knew that the work was never truly finished. There would always be someone who needed encouragement, someone who needed a role model, someone who needed to believe that they too could make a difference. And Michael would be there, ready to lead by example, ready to continue the journey that had begun with one small act of courage. Looking back, he realized how far he had come, how one decision, one moment of bravery, had sparked a movement. He wasn't just the boy who stood up for an elderly couple at the grocery store. He was the spark that ignited a fire in countless others. And together, they were all changing the world, one act of kindness at a time. Change, someone who had inspired others to believe that they too could make a difference. He thought about the times when he had doubted himself, when the thought of standing up for what was right had seemed like an impossible challenge. But now, looking back, he realized that all those doubts had been part of his journey, part of what had made him who he was. It was the fear and uncertainty that had fueled his desire to grow, to learn, and to become a stronger person. One evening, as Michael and Lena were having dinner, there was a knock at the door. Michael opened it to find a woman holding a large box of supplies. She smiled warmly at him. "Are you Michael?" she asked. "That's me," Michael replied, still surprised by the stranger's sudden appearance. "I'm Mrs. Harrison," the woman said. "I heard about the Young Champions Project and wanted to help. I've been collecting donations for the community drive, and I thought I could bring them over personally." Michael's heart swelled with gratitude as he took the box from her. "Thank you so much," he said. "This will make a huge difference." Mrs. Harrison smiled again, her eyes full of warmth. "You've inspired us all," she said, before turning to leave. "It's amazing to see a young person like you leading the way. I hope my kids will grow up with the same sense of courage and compassion." As Michael closed the door behind her, he felt a rush of emotion. It was one thing to hear about how his actions had made an impact, but it was another thing entirely to see it firsthand. People were coming together, not just because of his story, but because they believed in what it stood for. The idea that courage, no matter how small, could spark something much bigger. In the weeks that followed, more and more people in the community stepped forward to contribute. Some brought supplies, others volunteered their time, and some even offered their expertise. The project had grown into a full-fledged initiative, one that was beginning to transform lives in ways Michael had never imagined. And as the Young Champions group continued to expand, Michael found himself at the heart of a movement that was bigger than anything he had ever anticipated. But despite all the success, Michael remained humble. He never lost sight of the reason he had started this journey in the first place. It wasn't for the recognition or the accolades. It was to make a difference, to show people that they had the power to change the world, no matter how small their actions seemed. That realization came to him one night as he was walking home from a meeting. He passed the old grocery store where it had all begun, the place where he had stood up for Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. He stood there for a moment, looking at the familiar storefront, and remembered how frightened he had been back then. But now, standing in front of it, he saw it with new eyes. He saw the power of one small act of courage. And he realized that he hadn't just changed his life, he had changed the lives of everyone around him. As Michael walked home that night, he felt the weight of everything that had happened, but also the hope of what was still to come. The journey was far from over, and there were still so many people to help, so many lives to touch. But he knew that as long as he stayed true to his mission, sharing his courage, inspiring others to take action, and never backing down from doing what was right, he would continue to make a difference. He looked up at the stars, a smile spreading across his face. The world was vast, full of challenges and obstacles, but Michael knew one thing for certain: change was possible, and it could start with just one person, one act of courage. And as long as he had the strength to keep going, he would never stop striving to make the world a better place. The box from Mrs. Harrison. "Thank you so much," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "This will make such a difference for so many families." Mrs. Harrison smiled warmly, her eyes twinkling with kindness. "You're the one who's making a difference, Michael," she said. "It's incredible to see how much you've inspired others. I've seen the way the community has come together because of you. You've shown us all that we have the power to make the world a better place, one small act at a time." Michael felt a lump form in his throat as he nodded, humbled by her words. He never expected to be seen as someone who had made such an impact. All he had done was stand up for what he believed was right, but in doing so, he had sparked something far greater than he could have imagined. As he closed the door behind Mrs. Harrison and carried the box of supplies inside, Michael took a moment to reflect on how far he had come. The journey had been long, filled with moments of uncertainty and fear, but it had also been filled with moments of profound joy and fulfillment. He had learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to push through it and do what was right, even when it seemed difficult. He had learned that true leadership came from empowering others, not from standing alone. That night, as Michael sat with Lena, the conversation turned to the future. They spoke of the possibilities of the many projects they could undertake to continue helping those in need. Michael was eager to see how much more they could accomplish, how many more lives they could touch. The impact of his actions was still growing, and he knew that he was only beginning to see the ripple effects of what he had started. But even as he looked forward to the future, Michael knew that he would always carry with him the lessons he had learned along the way. The courage to act, the power of community, the belief that one person could truly make a difference. These would be his guiding principles wherever his path took him next. As the days passed and the Young Champions program continued to thrive, Michael remained a beacon of hope, a symbol of what could happen when people came together to do good. And while his journey had started with a single act of bravery in a grocery store, it had blossomed into something much greater, a movement, a change in the hearts of those around him, and the belief that anyone, no matter their age or circumstances, could make a difference. Michael's story had become a testament to the power of courage and kindness, a story that would continue to inspire generations to come. As the days passed, things seemed to fall into place for Michael. The community was stronger than ever, the young champions were thriving, and he had found a sense of peace he had never known before. But one evening, just as Michael was leaving the community center, something unusual happened. A black SUV, the same one that had appeared on the morning after he stood up for the Thompsons, pulled up to the curb. This time, the windows were tinted, the driver's face obscured. Michael's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Had they been watching him all this time? Before he could react, the passenger side window slowly rolled down. A mysterious figure, a man in a dark suit, leaned forward and handed him a small envelope. No words were exchanged, just a chilling silence. As Michael opened the envelope, his eyes widened. Inside was a single photograph, an image of a young boy, no older than Michael himself, standing in front of a small house. But what caught Michael's attention was the note beneath the photo. Asterisk, your next mission is here. Find him. It's not over. Asterisk, shaken but determined, Michael realized that his journey was far from over. The threats, the mysteries, and the challenges were only just beginning. He had thought he was done, but this was only the beginning of something much larger than he could have ever anticipated. All of a sudden, the weight of his responsibility hit him harder than ever. His next steps were more uncertain, more dangerous, but Michael knew one thing for sure: he couldn't back down now. The stakes were higher, and it seemed like the world was testing him in ways he hadn't expected. What was this mysterious new mission? And who was the boy in the photo? This is just the beginning. What do you think will happen next? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling updates. You won't want to miss what's coming next.